Interesting to have an opportunity to talk about the ethics of representation. I guess that representation is pretty much core business for Q&A because, in fact, what we're trying to do is represent a national discussion. And so there's a particular obligation on us to make sure that that representation is as inclusive as it can possibly be. It's certainly been an issue that we've been thinking about since the program began. And in fact, from the very first Q&A has had a quota system in place with regard to gender representation on the program. That was something that we just designed into the fabric of the program. I don't think necessarily because of our commitment to diversity, but because we thought Q&A would work better if it was a representative program that included men and women and people from all walks of life. But of course there are lots of constraints on our ability to be representative to do with the form of the program itself. Q&A is trying to achieve a number of objectives at once. We're trying to be representative of the national discussion, but we're also trying to generate an opportunity for Australian citizens to question their leaders, their political leaders in particular. And that means that we need to draw political leaders into the conversation. In order to do that, we have to include them on the panel. I don't know if anyone has had a close look at the Australian Parliament lately. But in terms of institutions that are supposed to be representative that aren't necessarily living up to those ideals, the Australian Parliament probably falls into that category. There's an interesting project that's organised by a public interest group called My Society that operates out of the UK that collects information about democracies and about parliaments in particular. They have a site called Every Politician. And they collect together politicians from parliaments all around the country. And they've started a project where you can go through, it's a crowdsourced project, where people can go through and look at the names of the different politicians and assign them to one gender or another in order to organise them. Because in fact, no one has done a proper international count of the representation of gender within parliaments. Australia's included in that list. If you have a look at Australia on the sort of league table of gender representation, you'll find that we're sort of down towards the bottom. We're in fact below South Sudan. We're above Iraq. We're in a group of nations that are all sort of clustered together around about 25%. And that's the finding of all sorts of research about gender representation in parliaments. The Parliamentary Library have had a look at parliaments, not just the federal parliament, but state parliaments as well. And if you do that, the figure gets up to around about 30%. But in terms of ministry representation, only about 20% of ministers across Australia, not just in federal parliament, but in the state parliaments as well, and that improves the picture, makes us look better, only about 20% are women. Now that's quite a challenge in terms of putting together a program that's designed to bring people who make political decisions and have them respond to Australian citizens and to be held accountable for those decisions, because the people who are decision makers are automatically men. And they are, generally taking up 2 out of the 5 positions on the Q&A panel, which means that there are only 3 positions that are left for other people who might be representatives of particular interest groups or commentators or columnists. And when you throw all that mix together, it means that over time it's quite difficult to get a genuinely representative mix of gender on the Q&A panel. So that was something that was thrown into the spotlight when Ray Martin and Sean Brown did their analysis of Q&A. It was a little bit of a surprise because they were supposed to be looking at all sorts of things about the program, but they latched on to this one particular issue. And in a sense, that's been quite useful because it's given us an opportunity to go back and sort of redouble our efforts. Because as I said, being representative has been a priority for Q&A from the very beginning. The program's now been in operation since 2008. But in my experience, good intentions don't really deliver when it comes to trying to improve diversity and representation at Q&A. Because there are so many different priorities, because you're trying to meet news targets, because you're trying to bring people onto the panel who are able to answer strong questions from the audience, because there's some big new event that means that someone who's in the news, who's available to be on the panel, just has to have a seat on the panel. Having targets for including more women or more groups who are underrepresented generally in the Australian political discussion, you end up just sort of reinforcing the problem that's already out there. You end up reinforcing the disparities that exist within Parliament, reinforcing the disparities that exist within the media, because you're having to work off that base. So if you want someone who can answer a question about why they've made a particular decision, a particular political decision about how resources are allocated in Australia, well, the chances are 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 that person is going to be a man, for example. And the chances that they come from a non-English speaking background are also very low. So that over time, the Q&A panel has trouble representing the broader society in exactly the same way that the power structures that exist in Australia, and in particular Parliament, have trouble accurately representing the broader Australian population. I certainly think we do better in terms of the audience and the population that's included in our audience and in the people who are asking the questions. But of course, the people who are asking the questions, they're the voice of people who aren't making decisions, who are asking people who are making decisions about why they've made those decisions. So it's never quite as satisfactory to be on the asking side of things as it is to be in a position of power and able to give the answers. I think that what has made a difference in terms of the spotlight that the Ray Martin, Sean Brown inquiry threw onto the gender mix at Q&A is that the spotlight itself made us rethink how we should approach turning our good intentions into actual results. And the plan and the strategy that we've sort of settled on is to provide more opportunities for people to measure how well we're doing. So we've moved, for example, to publishing each week a measure of how the discussion within the program is divided, what we call the share of voice. So what percentage of the discussion was dominated by this politician? What percentage of the discussion was dominated by that politician? What percentage of the discussion went to this commentator? And it means that there's an opportunity then for people to have a look at that mix of voices and see, oh my God, this cabinet minister managed to gather 33% of the discussion, whereas this representative from a welfare group has only got 15% of the discussion. And that's useful in terms of holding us to account in terms of the audience, but it's also, I think, very useful in terms of holding us to account to ourselves. And so because we know that that measurement's being done, we know that that measurement is out there and visible, we're able to keep that at the forefront of our minds and to adjust our behaviour. And hopefully over the time that's going to shift the balance so that we have a better representation of voices within the program and on the program. Now, of course, Q&A isn't able to solve the inequality of diversity within the Australian political system or Australian society. It is, after all, just a television program. And as I said, one of the things that has occurred is that there's been a spotlight on one particular aspect of our diversity on Q&A, and that's the gender mix within the program. But I think that that's certainly, to some extent, taken attention away from all of the other issues of diversity that Q&A could be questioned on. Is there an appropriate mix of different ethnic groups within Q&A? Are we getting enough representation of different classes within society? There's a whole range of benchmarks that Q&A could and should be held to account to that for the moment have sort of slipped into the background. All we can do is try and address those over time. Thank you.